Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Emanuele for a playful conversation. I love watching his mind think, and it's a reminder that philosophy doesn't have to be stale or dead. You are life in action, watching you think, and it's always a joy. And if you thought that was a little weird, just wait. I really appreciated Joella's call not to bifurcate the arts and the sciences, and that bifurcation is actually a relatively recent bifurcation in history. But be that as it may, we do have a session right now dedicated to the arts as such, titled Botanical Art and Fungal Sounds. And when I asked my colleague, Alitza Koeva, who could chair this session, who could really hold a conversation about art as well as a lecture performance about sound, she said, you have to get Caroline Jones. And we are so lucky that we did. So I will briefly introduce Caroline Jones, and then I'll pass it off to her to introduce this session, and we'll go from there. Okay, Caroline Jones is professor in the History, Theory, and Criticism section of the Department of Architecture at MIT. She studies modern and contemporary art, focusing on its technological modes of production, distribution, and reception, and on its interface with science. She has also worked as curator recently in 3 exhibitions at MIT's Last Visual Arts Center. Her exhibitions and/or films have been shown at the MoMA in New York, the MoMA in San Francisco, the Hirshhorn in DC, and the Hara Museum of Tokyo, among many other venues. She has many publications, and I won't list them all here, and she is currently researching patterns of occlusion and political contestation in what she calls the anthropogenic image of environmental disaster, in collaboration with historian of science Peter Gallison. Caroline, thank you for making time in your busy schedule today to be here. We're happy to have you. Join me in welcoming Caroline.
I was actually thrilled. I thought I crowbarred myself into this fabulous event, and I'm sorry that I missed what sounds like an amazing day so far. I'm also glad I'm not a plant, because I had to get from the Museum of Science to here in a lift in 15 minutes, and I know that would have been hard if I was a pine tree. So I'm really looking forward to this session. I'm here to be surprised. So I don't know these amazing people's work. Although, I've seen them from afar, but obviously I want to just validate being together in person, which, as we know, after COVID still has a very important value. So my instructions are quite specific, numbered, very serious, begin on time. I think we've already broken that rule. Speaker introduction. I'm going to briefly introduce both of them, just in the interest of time. There is a moment of breaking down this kind of configuration for Sean's performance, so maybe I'll give a more lavish introduction to Giovanni, and then we'll have time to introduce Sean later. So Giovanni comes to us from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is one of the most vibrant and powerful art instruction confabulations with a lot of theorists and thinkers, and the students really benefit from colleagues that I've come to love and admire, like Claire Pentecost, who've been thinking with plants and fungi and soil for decades. Giovanni has an incredibly impressive publication resume, and I briefly just want to highlight a few, like Speculative Taxidermy, Why Look at Plants. He's going to be talking about some of these. I think the one I'm most intrigued by is a very recent one, co-edited with Michael Marder, who is himself a vegetal philosopher, and that one is called Vegetal Entwinements. So we have a very powerful talk coming up from Giovanni, Vegetal Realism and Plant Politics, and I'm going to be really interested in what you have to say about the silence of plants, because I'm wondering if that's not a human category. So I'm going to put that question in the room, and join me in welcoming Giovanni. I'm going to give you time stamps, because that's one of my rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Rachel, for organizing this incredible event. And as I was saying earlier, it's incredible how these presentations sort of entwine in ways that could have not been anticipated. And yet it all seems somewhat strangely organic. And I'm sure tonight, as the fallout sediments, new germinations will take place for tomorrow and the next few days. It looks incredibly exciting. So I just thought, given the time I have to speak to you, to really tackle something complicated and that literally would require 3 days. I'm not going to take up the whole duration of the symposium, but I wanted to talk to you about something I care about a lot that has developed over time through my publications on plants. And it's almost like sometimes you think you're focusing on something. You think you're focusing is plants, and then actually you realize that there are very strong roots that lead elsewhere or that ground all these different publications in very interesting ways. And I became more and more aware that realism is one of the bones of contention that I'm wrestling throughout my career. And it wasn't like a complete epiphany. It's like, oh, by the way, all these years I've been writing about realism. But there's a difference between thinking about writing about plants and their relationships with us and art, and actually narrowing down what I think is a deeply problematic area of our relationship with plants, but also of our cultural coevolutions with plants. And just to kind of like throw out a few ideas to give us a baseline, realism is complicated, right? This is a multidisciplinary gathering. And I'm sure that as I say realism, you're all thinking about realism within your own subjects, right? You're thinking about realism in science, realism in theater, in cinema. And in every subject, the term realism means something slightly different, sometimes radically different. These are some of the books that have informed my understanding of realism. And over time, I've come to accept the idea that no definition of realism does justice to what I see happening in contemporary art. I've realized that every time an artist shows something or displays something that entails some kind of realism, they recraft and remold that term in sometimes very nuanced and imperceptible ways. It's like a vernacular that constantly gets molded slightly differently. Initially, I found that daunting, and then I found that extremely exciting, and that's where I am right now. I think I'm like in the groove of realism. But like I said, I've been in the groove of realism for a while. I spent a lot of time thinking about taxidermy and how taxidermy deceives us through its indexical realism. I'm going to talk briefly about why indexical realism is really interesting, I think, in contemporary art. In my book, Speculative Taxidermy, I talk extensively about decorum and how, despite the heightened realism of the taxidermy skin, ideology runs rife in the way the taxidermists pose the animals. So these are basically classical sculptures in disguise. They're furry classical sculptures. And they inform our gender, and they inform normativity in so many ways. Decorum is such an incredibly powerful thing that we give for granted, that subliminally tells us who we are meant to be and how we ought to behave and what we should or shouldn't say. So that's where I became more interested in this construction. You know, we know that, of course, realism is part of a construction. It's always ideological. It's always political, especially if contextualized in certain ways. And it's incredibly good. Any really good work that entails realism is extremely good at erasing the traces of the artist. And I explored realism further through my book, Lucian Freud Herbarium. Lucian Freud was extremely keen, especially after 1951, when he switched his style dramatically, to capture the detailed nuances of his house plants. And I kind of elaborated ideas around the notion of a plant identity in this book and in others that followed. What does it mean, according to Lucian Freud, to stare at a plant with such intensity that he thought the gaze alone could evince something truthful through the realistic depiction of a plant about existence more broadly? I thought that proposition was incredibly interesting, especially because it just flew in the face of the tradition of still life from the Dutch Golden Age that we know so well, where we find this paradox embedded in the very idea of realism. We have a form of hyper-realistic representation here that is lying between its teeth to us about everything. These blooms never came together. The artists never sat in front of them. It's impossible to paint these plants at the speed required by both, right? They're on different time scales. They're all copied from other artists' paintings, botanical treatises, sketches the artists made elsewhere. So these are like assemblages where different time scales just gather and are all bashed together into a utopia that I love. It's hard not to love them. I mean, like, the lighting is everything, isn't it? The lighting is just blending everything realistically so that the illusion of realism can come together. And I absolutely love that. However, I wrote about the silence of plants and how this type of engagement with realism tampers, disrespects, objectifies plants by imposing a vocalization, our human morals, ethics. I wish I had more time to talk to you about how complex these still lives are. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the origin of these still lives, the Protestant Reformation, artists needing to make money, being forbidden to paint saint Madonnas and Jesuses. They channel Christian teachings through flowers and plants. And I've always found that complex in our relationship with plants and problematic on a number of levels. I know you're all familiar with the concept of plant blindness, and paradoxically, this is plant blindness. So the whole of Western art has sort of pretended to invite us to look at plants, to really just hold a mirror to our faces constantly. And that, of course, has led to this objectification of nature. It has led to so much diminishing of what plants and animals, of course, are about. And in this talk, I also combine my concerns about realism and how deceitful it can be with notions of political art. I disagree with Timothy Morton that all art is ecological. We can talk about this later if you like, certainly no time here. Also, I don't believe that all art is political, right? This all is something that just makes everything into nothing. And for instance, an example of political art, very famous, Jacques-Louis David and his portrayal of Napoleon, where you can see here that there's a lot of aggrandizing going on. What I love about this painting, and I never get tired to talk to my students about it, is this kind of like response by De La Roche, who actually brought a level of realism to the truth of what was actually happening on the Alps. So back to that power, right? Realism constructs truth. It's a highly ideological tool. It's been used by many artists, especially during the 19th century. Think photography, the invention of photography, 1826, 1839, changes the world. The invention of cinema, of course, comes after this incredible painting by Manet that shocked because of its heightened realism, right? The dirt under the feet of Olympia, her visible nipples, all these details, the ugliness of Courbet's funeral at Ornans, the people that showed too much rawness on their faces and real suffering. But of course, we also have socialist realism, right? Once again, screens, smoke, and portrayals that not only construct truth, but they create a feedback loop. That's one of the incredible abilities of realism, because it looks like what we perceive around us with our eyes. It implicitly says to us, trust me, I'm telling you the truth. Foucault talked extensively about what he called Quattrocento painting, right? Renaissance painting. And he talks about how it's always affirmative. And I love that notion. He's right. Any true realist work of art, or work of art that deploys realism, always tells the viewer, this is. There is no room for speculation, there is no room for ambiguity, there is no room for questioning. Therefore, the viewer is pacified, becomes a passive spectator of a performance in which everything happens on this stage that keeps creating and crafting truth. So it is in the context of these problematics that I have started to work on this concept of vegetal realism. And I could have come here showing you something polished and something finished, but you've got those books I showed you earlier. If you'd like to take a look, there's polished and finished there. But I really wanted to use this opportunity to gather some thoughts with you about this process. So what is vegetal realism, according to me, at this stage in the journey? It's an ethical aesthetic approach that centers on the unique agency, histories, and ecological significance of specific and situated plant life. It forges connections and foregrounds entwinements between vegetal being and human histories of displacement, resilience, and coevolutions. It prioritizes acts of witnessing, regeneration, and respectful co-creation over instrumental representation, seeking to honor and respect the alterity of plants while illuminating interdependent networks of cultural, ecological, and political meaning. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if we look back at the history of the last century and the first original, not necessarily conventionally objectifying instances of plant presence in art, we encounter incredible works like these that have been mostly erased from the history of art book. How many of you have seen this before? See? But we all know Duchamp's urinal, right? Of course we know. So Edward Steichen brought delphiniums that he had gigantified through selection to MoMA. This is not something that happened in a small kind of provincial museum, therefore we can excuse the reason why it was mostly erased. It's got to do with plants. That's why it was mostly erased by the history of art book. I say mostly, I think it actually has been completely erased. Interesting, indeed. My problem with it is that it does a lot, and it does many interesting things related to the conception of the work of art, time, durability, fetishization. There is so much in that gesture of replacing the representation of a plant with the presentation of a plant in the museum, right? A plant that will perish, a plant that cannot be collected by the institution, a plant that will, by its very, very definition, just make the whole institutional discourse of the museum crumble. We do find plants in Helioiticica tropicalia. Love Helioiticica. This is one of those works that gives curators a headache because of the biohazard it poses to museums. Plants here represent a sort of abstracted notion of Brazil as a tropical fantasy to the Western tourist. So my hunch here is that the plant gets objectified by being generalized. Other example, Joseph Cassatt, we get this very famous paradigm that he explores with different objects. 1 in 3 plants, in this case, can be staged with different plant species. The work, the meaning of the work is not affected by the replacement of the plant. Neither it matters where the plant comes from, or how old it is, who grew it, right? The plant becomes this stand-in as part of the semantic structure of the work itself. So more recently, I've become interested in forms of vegetal realism. So I'm trying to kind of get my head around what these artists are doing. One of them is Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio that I want to briefly talk to you about. And the other one is Tuitstanat Cis Weiss. They work with very different media and in very different ways. This is the work of Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio, and Gardens are Cis Weiss medium. So I'm not trying to create a protocol for artists to follow. That would be dreadful. What I'm trying to do is to wrap my head around what artists are doing, because with every work, they teach me something new about what what I thought was realism, right? And I really enjoy following them. So teach me what realism is in your work. What I'm coming to understand here is that with every work involving plants, we encounter a new conception of realism that is doing something to our conception of plants and our conception of our relationship with them. So, just in a nutshell, I encountered the work of Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio at Mocha Geffen a couple of years ago now, and I was blown away. These are enormous skins, as you can see, and they look almost shroud-like, and they are casts of ceiba and ficus trees that used to live in LA, planted during the 40s and 50s to create shadow in the city, of course. And they have now been earmarked for eradication. Why? Because they're doing this to the sidewalks. Their root systems are particularly challenging to the infrastructure of the city. So Aparicio does not depict trees, he creates relics of their lived pasts to foreground entwined and very real history of exploitation and subjugation. Through his meticulous rubber castings of ceiba and ficus bark, he looks at the current dislocation and removal of Latin American immigrants that were brought to the United States at the same time as these trees to enrich the community and support the development of the city, but that are now seen as undesirable. So the artist engages with plants as both living material, witness, and memories. Indexicality, in this case, lies at the heart of the process. The surfaces he captures are direct imprints, scars, carvings, cracks, and growth, recorded in all their topographical precision. The skins are not merely aesthetic objects, they are testimonies, silent archives of coexistence, resilience, and erasure. A detail I found particularly interesting is that Aparicio uses the rubber created from the Castilla elastica tree in order to capture the skin of these trees. And this is a species native to El Salvador, which is also connected to the history and biography of the artist. So you can see these connections between his life, cultures of immigrants that live in LA that are being now central to contemporary diasporas, and the specific histories of these trees, the species that are chosen, and their situatedness is central to the works. I can show you quickly some of the images here of how beautiful and haunting these skins are. In some of them, he combines clothing from people who have been dispossessed and removed forcibly, creating this blurring between the boundaries of nature and culture. And quickly to outline the work of Esse Weiss. Esse Weiss, as I mentioned earlier, works with gardens. As an indigenous artist, she is particularly concerned with building communities and creating living works of art. To me, that really is one of the biggest revolutions that's taking place right now in the contemporary environment. Gardens are the new galleries, right? They are challenging institutional constructs, conceptions of what an artwork should be, and they bring people together to generate sustenance. But what Esse Weiss does that it's extremely important to me, and we talked extensively about this, is that she cares about the long-term impact of these gardens. We were talking about what does it mean to build a garden for an institution, and our consensus in the conversation was that we need to educate institutions to understand that a garden is a living work of art. And there's a whole framework that we need to develop together to make sure that museums do not take on the trendiness of having artists growing a garden just to dismantle it when the exhibition comes to an end. A garden has a legacy. A garden has a continuous life that invites other artists to partake into a dialogue, into a discourse. So just to conclude my theorization kind of extemporaneous to a degree of vegetal realism, just wanted to propose that it's a productive framework for artists engaging with plant life. This approach transcends traditional representations, fostering a collaborative relationship between artists and plants. Rather than imposing symbolic meanings, vegetal realism emphasizes an emphatic alignment with the unique identities, histories, and agencies of plants. This paradigm does not reject symbolism outright. Instead, it advocates for a thoughtful integration where symbolism arises organically, stemming from the plant's identity, its history, and coevolution with humans, other animals, and the soil. By foregrounding the plant's own narratives, artists create works that are multidimensional, intertwining political, ecological, biological, and mythological threads. In embracing vegetal realism, artists can contribute to a broader discourse that recognizes plants as active participants in our shared environment. Thank you.
So there's going to be some restaging up here, I understand, for a fantastic lecture performance to come. And I'll introduce that lecture performer, who is Sean Parkinson, who is a visual artist, composer, performer, writer, researcher, and the most beautiful affiliation is with the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, Scotland. So today, Sean is going to be helping us with a piece titled Reimagining Smelly Plants and Fungi in Art and Sound. So juxtaposing already with Giovanni's interesting meditations on the silence of plants and humans speaking for them, we will have, apparently, a live performance of a human being and speaking as and with and for fungi. So we might already be thinking of questions that would compare the vegetal and the fungal, different kingdoms, after all. And I personally want to provide a thought picture in your head of Steichen's delphiniums being allowed into the MoMA sculpture garden, right? So these vegetal things are put into human categories of taste, where Steichen's delphiniums would have definitely been kitschy, right? So anyway, lots to think about.
Why do some smelly plants and fungi resist representation? And how might music make their odor audible? I'm going to speak for precisely 19 minutes. And in that time, I'm going to share images in various states of close-up and animation of 3 olfactory objects. And the aim of this talk is to help connect these 3 smelly things, people, plants, mushrooms, in your mind via this word, corpsing. Now, corpsing is maybe not a word that has made its way over from Britain, where I'm from, Scotland to be specific. In the 1950s, the British slang word corpsing was literal because it was when an actor pretending on stage to be a dead body in a moment that was supposed to be serious would start to stifle a laugh. Air would leak out. They would start to murmur, and that would put off their fellow actors. Corpsing, or breaking character, as you might know it, is sonic, but it's also contagious. It's infectious. You can't corpse alone. You need an audience. Corpsing, although developed from a noun, is a verb. It's dynamic. It's a body that is in a state of bacterial decay. The 3 objects I'm going to describe to you are a dead French nun, a giant flower or inflorescence, and a phallic mushroom. And what all these objects share in common is, one, their association with flowering plants and fungi, and the French nun who you're looking at now, by association, for her name was Little Flower, who died in 1897. Roman Catholics flooded to her corpse, for they heard tell of a scent of roses and violets emanating from her body, which, as you know, the odor of sanctity relates to a body that is incorruptible. And Little Flower was photographed by her sister, Céline Martin. And to borrow a quote from Barthes, she is dead and she is waiting to die. The image, no matter how close, how saturated, no matter how much we press up to the glass, can never truly represent that which lies behind it. When her body was exhumed twice more, once in 1910 and again in 1923, 2 years before she was beatified, the two workmen who remade her coffin described, when they opened the lid, again, the smell of violets and roses. Now, why is that? Is it anticipation? Was it preemptive? Did they expect this floral fragrance? Or was it because in low intensities, a rotting corpse shares similar volatile organic compounds with roses and lilies, which were used historically to mask the smells of decaying bodies that were stored out of the back? So in low intensities, the smell of indole, which is present in rotting flesh, but also in feces, has a sweet floral odor. So, mass pilgrimage, pilgrims for the putrid, is the first example I'm going to talk about. There is an example that stretches even farther back, and a stinky phallic mushroom, which is the proto-mushroom in the history of mycology, in the history of mycological literature. In 1564, a Dutch physician called Hadrianus Junius crawled about on all fours in the sand dunes of coastal Netherlands and described a bastard plant that should not have been where it was, growing in sand dunes rather than cold, dark, sour places as fungi typically grew. He wrote this publication in 1564, 16 pages long, and he includes a narrative description in prose, but also a long poem. Talks about this divine phallus, the Facinus, named after himself now, Phallus Hadrianus, Phallus Hadriani, Adrian's phallus, which is a moniker I think he would have been proud of. He gave this mushroom to a Renaissance painter who drew it, and this image, anatomized, came to symbolize the pinnacle of artistic representation at that period. At the Botanic Gardens, where I work as sniffer in residence, I go about opening drawers and inhaling their contents. And what I found there, historically, mushrooms that go back to 150 years old, still with traces of their odor, that have matured into something that smells fruity, like chipotle chilies, or like gym shorts, or like post-coitus, still has no bearing to the original odor that must have met the collector. Sometimes it just says smells, which is the same as saying it feels or it looks. Odor has been diminished in our sensorium for hundreds of years. It's as if we don't trust our noses, or at least the language that acts as a step-naming process in order to describe to others our own experiences. And in the spirit of Albrecht Dürer, who said in the 16th century, to draw what you see This idea of a mediation between artist and nature being one where that gap is foreshortened. I took that challenge up and went and sniffed out this mushroom for myself and found that, yes, indeed it does smell, but it smells of itself, not of a corpse, not of violets, not of Limburger cheese or sweaty socks, not of semen or of rotting bacon. Although we privilege the site of the phallus, it grows from an egg, which Pliny described as a vulva, which just means wrapper. So this genderful mushroom, I'll tell you a little bit about the language and how it's been anatomized and our desperate attempts to throw everything at this. It emerges from the soil first, birthed via this vulva, from which emerges the phallus. Again, an object named after our own body parts. At the tip of the phallus is the glans, which just means acorn, and it's upon this glans that bears the spores, a single speck of which can contain up to 20 million spores. Small, so small in fact, designed to pass through the digestive systems of flies. It smells at every stage. At its overripe stage, which in intensities have been described as very, very mushroomy. It's an image and an object that even since it was described in the 16th century, because of its excess, because of its ridiculous sight, because of its overwhelming scent, which only intensifies if you take it back in your car to photograph on your kitchen table, conjures a similar experience of an actor pretending to be a corpse, in that that effect is contagious. It pervades up to several kilometers and can tease out flyers from God knows where at whatever time of year. It also invites laughter. There's a reason why this is the proto-mushroom, why it appears on so many mushroom identification guides, why it was the subject of both artists and naturalists from the 16th century onwards. Because, again, in the spirit of ambivalence, it's something that quivers at the edge of delight and disgust. It's something that we inevitably, inadvertently, gasp at. We make a noise in response to it, whether that's or It has its own noise. The three flies, the main flies that are attracted to it, Calliphora vicinia, Calliphora vomitaria, which actually just means bearer of beauty, and Musca domestica. To go back to what was posited earlier, if you play the sounds of the humming that they make as they're attracted to it, you get a D sharp, and that third note, an F, which isn't a true chord. It's dissonant, it's unresolved, and we can imagine that stink making a type of sound, and it's actually the sound, as much as the smell, that leads us towards it. You're aware of the corpse flower, Amorphophallus titanum, discovered, in inverted commas, discovered in 1878 by Odoardo Beccari, whose first name, Odoardo, is an almost perfect anagram of a bad odor. In his dispatches, in his letters, were published in the Garden's Chronicle the same year, mentions no aspect of its smell, because its smell is short-lived. It's a rare blossoming event, but one that we've encountered much more in the 150 years since it's been discovered. It's now bloomed 510 times. since it was first cultivated in India and then in Kew Gardens. And the Times newspaper reported riots as people flocked to not only see this misshapen phallus, amorphophallus, but to catch a whiff of its reeking odor, which people described again and again of smelling fetid, like rotten flesh. Again, they're objects that are beyond our phenomenology. Even if you've smelled a corpse for yourself, when we're encountering this olfactory object, it resists because of its excess, not because of its size, the largest unbranched inflorescence in the world, but because of its odor. It's become a botanical celebrity. And in the naming, its scientific naming still favors the phallic shape, but which clever marketeers from Botanic Gardens have tried to lure audiences in with affectionate nicknames like Putricia, Darth Vapor, Dame Judy Stench, and my favorite, which should be pronounced, I think, in an Australian accent, the amazing Stinko. In terms of its size, the smell in which it occupies is far greater than its 3-meter-long spadix, which, if you want another esoteric reference, is the same scale as an erect blue whale penis, the largest mammalian penis in the world, which I'm sure you all know. But the point I'm getting to is this. By going out in search of these rare experiences, superlatives of size, but also superlatives of stink, we have inadvertently inserted ourselves into its ecology. Both the stinkhorn and the corpse flower are pollinated, or the spores are dispersed by corpse-loving and shit-loving flies and beetles. But now you're far more likely to witness this monster in a climate-controlled glasshouse than you are in the rainforests of Western Sumatra. We, in our appetite for olfactory experiences of the extreme, have unwittingly become saprophiles, lovers of death and decay. But, as the poet Kimberly Johnson described, what you want, you can't film. This is the problem of our desperate attempts to describe, in whatever medium, in singing, in prose, in poetry, in woodcut illustration, in macro photography, in 4K movies at 30 frames per second. What you want, you can't film. This is our failure. This is a failure of everybody in this room in our attempts to organize and categorize the natural world and where we fit within it. And therefore, maybe a type of music that references the humming of flies, which all begin, at least in Romance languages, with the letter M, the earliest phoneme, M, which is indicative of mother's milk and mammary glands, but a sound trace towards a smell. In Arabic and Hebrew, zvav, a sound that passes your ear, zvav. If you could do me a favor, shrug your ego off just for a second. If you could give me a droning tone for approximately 1 minute, I think maybe we could try to conjure ourselves in the form of a stink choir. So listen up, take a breath, close your lips and hum as loud as you can and keep it going after every breath. For 1 minute, please. What you want, you can't fill, you can't write, you can't say. What you want, you can't dance. Ooh. Ooh. Moscow's about. May I just say that in the kindest way possible, you stink. Thank you. I'm going to stand here awkwardly now, like this, with my bulbous costume.
It's great. I'm not sure we need a table.
I've got a table here, look at this.
I know. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you for letting us know.
Thanks.
I wondered why we didn't buzz.
Well, there is again a reference that shows the differences between our countries. In the history of language, at least in British English, the word hum connotes both pervasive smell and also a persistent sound. So we can say that the person sat next to you on the subway ride home is really humming when they smell really bad.
I thought I spoke English. Amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. We're going to have questions. We're going to just stand here because in honor of the standing fungal vegetal, who can't sit.
Can't sit.
He's already effloresced, you know? And I guess I get the privilege of asking a first question. Mm-hmm. So realism is, for this art historian, an aesthetic system, right, that is attempting to understand some relationship. It's only named by a political artist, Courbet, right? So I'm curious to really get you to think with realism, because of course, realism is completely dependent on a language of description that goes on something and says Napoleon crossing the Alps, or says burial at Ornans, right? These words. Mm-hmm. So the olfactory, as you point out, just simply has none. And it is the language of plants. And it is the language of fungi. Mm-hmm. It is the chemical signal, is the way that these alterities reach their pollinators, reach their motility, as it were, right? So in their fixity, they use chemistry in ways we've forgotten to use and we've forgotten to name. So can we conjure a realism without language? Can we get there?
Well, we have attempted to, but again, it just forms a different type of metonymy. So, you know, when Juliet says a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, what if, her dying partner was called a Romeo? And I think that it does have an effect. Words do have an effect, but also they still remain at a distance. So that common mushroomy odor has a chemical name 1-octanol 3,1. But if I go into a room and say, wow, this smells really 1-octanol 3,1-y, then we're not going to get closer to that experience. It's about trying to find that common language. Right. Chemistry, I think, still does not get us closer to it. It gives us another stand-in. It gives us another substitute
right.
for smell.
I want to just smell this and see if there's anything
I wouldn't
to
dare.
report. The words for smell in English are extremely impoverished. The word itself, as you kind of point out, is completely undetermined. If I say I smell, you might not know whether that means I'm emanating, I'm humming something odoriferous, or, my nose is functioning today. It's either a transitive or an intransitive, an object or a subject. It is completely incoherent. So the artist Cecil Tolis has attempted to make a smell language, but there's no one to speak it. She's not raising children to speak it, right? So we're fucked in terms of becoming vegetal, which is the dream we have here on stage, right? So Juliet can only say that the rose smells sweet, which is a taste. Like we just, English is particularly bad, is what I'm saying. Do you want to think about realism and smell and where we might start?
I think in the context of Sean's performance, because I've been wondering how ideas that I've been exploring might or not work in the context of what you're doing, made me think about the speculative realm. So it brought me back to my book, Speculative Taxidermy, and that kind of openness at the edges where artists manipulate form to deliberately hinder the affirmative value of language and create this sort of area of speculation, which is a bit of a blur or a bit of a kind of fizzling out question in itself. So you have still a core, I think, of realism of a more classical kind at the very base of it. You did call out fungi, specific species, but then you took us to the margins, to the edges of that affirmative foundation, to the point that you made us all hum to become fungal. And that is where I think there's a speculative dimension that doesn't quite pertain to what I'm doing with vegetal realism, but it's still a paradigm I've encountered a lot, and it's very productive. I've written about that more in the context of animals and animal skin, but definitely there as a productive framework.
So I can think of one word that's been invented that everyone uses, which is petrichor. So in the first instance of a rainstorm, a gentle rainstorm, you've experienced this as children. There's a kind of a smell that comes to you. Is it the ozone on the ground? Is it the dust that is suddenly awakening? It turns out to be a bacterial signal. So we don't have to know what it is to have come up with this name, which I think Australians invented. It means like rock scent or something like that.
Great challenge to attempt some semblance of a wrap-up for this day. In the beginning of the day, I invoked circumnutation as a motion that resists, lapsing into opposites. And I love that we had the invocation of Nicholas of Cusa and his Coincidentia Oppositorium from the 15th century. So to end, I just actually want to name some of these opposites, these false dualisms that we have been kind of circling around as a guidepost, perhaps, as we move forward into our day tomorrow, which will be a really exciting day in the afternoon as we head to the Arboretum to actually live some of these concepts in relationships with plants. So some of these opposites, coincidence of opposites I heard that we learned are actually, false opposites. Forest and city, false opposite. Delight and disgust. Observer, observed. Cooperation, competition. Science and contemplation, and of course, the one and the many. So these are some of these opposing forces that are causing us, I think, to spiral upward, resisting reduction. Thank you all so much for your patience. A reminder tomorrow to please wear comfortable shoes as we are headed into the Arboretum, and that is rain or shine, so please do look at the forecast and plan accordingly. But thank you all for a fantastic, dynamic first day, and we'll see you at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.